At the crest of a wooded rise above Gull Lake in southwestern Michigan, more than 100 feet above the waterline, stands a 15,000 square foot Tudor manor with the air of something transplanted from another country and another century. It is stately, theatrical, almost improbably composed against the lake and sky. Its owner, one of the richest men in the United States, gave it a name so modest it borders on irony. He called it simply the cottage. But nothing about the life that led to this house was modest, and nothing about it was easy. The man who built this estate did not begin life as a master of industry, or even as a man expected to become one. For nearly half his life, he lived in the shadow of someone more brilliant, more celebrated, more feared. He worked punishing hours for little money. He handled the bookkeeping, the correspondence, the errands, the details no one remembers because empires are rarely built by the men history notices first. He existed for years as a pair of hands in service to another man's vision. And that man was his brother. The humiliations were not abstract. They were daily, intimate, and impossible to forget. He was expected to be available at every moment, under every circumstance. He ran beside a bicycle, with a notebook in hand so that no passing thought from his employer would be lost. He stood by while instructions were delivered from behind a bathroom door. He was not treated as family. He was treated as staff. The famous doctor at the center of this world demanded obedience, efficiency, and deference. The younger brother gave all three. Then, in 1906, the balance of power shifted. The anonymous clerk became a founder. The overlooked younger brother stepped out from behind the ledger and into American commerce. He built a cereal company that did more than sell breakfast. It sold reliability, routine, modernity, and his own name. He understood something his more idealistic brother never truly grasped. People do not build habits around doctrine. They build them around pleasure, convenience, and trust. And so, box by box, ad by ad, signature by signature, he created one of the most recognizable brands in the country. By the time this house rose above Gull Lake in 1925, W.K. Kellogg was no longer the neglected younger brother from Battle Creek. He was a public figure, a corporate force, a man whose surname sat on kitchen shelves across America and far beyond it. The cottage was more than a summer residence. It was a declaration, a private monument to escape, a reward perhaps, or a rebuttal, because the past had not released him. Even as he built this lakeside retreat, the old war was still alive. His brother, the celebrated physician who had treated presidents, industrialists, and American royalty of every kind, was now fighting him for control of the family name. What followed was not merely a business dispute, it was a struggle over authorship, legitimacy, and memory. Who had made the fortune? Who had shaped the product? Who had the right to claim the legacy? The lawsuits dragged on. The bitterness calcified. For years, the two men remained bound by blood and divided by everything else. They would spend decades speaking as little as possible. And then, near the end of the elder brother's life, a final gesture arrived at this house on the hill, a letter meant to close the distance between them, a confession, an apology, perhaps even an act of surrender. W.K. Kellogg did not open it, not while there was still time. This is a story about far more than cereal. It is about American success in one of its purest and cruelest forms. Ambition sharpened by humiliation, wealth built out of resentment, and a dynasty founded not on harmony but fracture. It is about what survives when triumph hardens into loneliness, about the emotional debt hidden beneath fortunes that look, from a distance, serene. If you're drawn to stories about great houses, powerful families, and the private costs concealed behind public grandeur, stay with me. This one begins here, above Gull Lake, at the house called the Cottage. By 1925, W.K. Kellogg had reached the age at which many men begin to narrow their lives. He did the opposite. At 65, after decades of deprivation, discipline, and private grievance, he allowed himself an extravagance so complete it bordered on myth. His cereal empire was turning out roughly 120,000 boxes a day. The name that once belonged to a disregarded younger brother now moved through grocery stores, kitchens, breakfast rooms, and factory ledgers across the country. Wealth, at last, had arrived not as comfort, but as scale. And scale was what he chose. About 15 miles from Battle Creek, on the high ground above Gull Lake, he found the site that would become his retreat. It was a commanding piece of land, 32 acres, with some 1,600 feet of private shoreline and a vantage point more than 100 feet above the water. From there, the lake did not merely glimmer, it submitted to view. The setting had the drama of a stage set designed for a man who had spent most of his life off stage. After years of inhabiting the margins of other people's power, Kellogg selected a place where the horizon itself seemed arranged in his favor. He did not want a summer house in the plain American sense. He wanted age. He wanted lineage. He wanted the visual language of permanence, the sort of architecture that implies inheritance even when it has been newly bought. To realize that desire, he turned to Benjamin and Benjamin, the Grand Rapids firm commissioned to design the estate. What they produced was not modest, despite the name he would give it. It was a carefully composed Tudor revival manor, half-timbering, stucco infill, steep roof lines, old-world detailing. The whole composition meant to suggest that it had not been built in the 20th century by an industrial magnate, but had somehow survived intact from an older, more stratified civilization. The facade carried the glamour of English country house romance. Leaded windows caught the changing light off the lake. Heraldic motifs lent the structure an air of borrowed ancestry. The roof, laid in costly imported tile, was punctuated by terracotta chimney pots that sharpened the silhouette and deepened the illusion. This was not the architecture of self-made America, blunt and new and unapologetic. It was the architecture of someone reaching backward, toward gentility, toward Europe, toward the sort of settled authority that cannot be manufactured by advertising alone. Yet the house itself was only the center of a larger composition. Kellogg did not build a residence so much as a world. The grounds were treated not as landscape but as narrative, every structure contributing to the image of a cultivated estate assembled by a man with means and appetite. A Dutch windmill rose from the property with almost theatrical precision, decorative in purpose, exacting in execution. Elsewhere stood a greenhouse capable of producing roses, flowering plants, and citrus throughout the year, beauty and abundance held under glass, disciplined and made perpetual. Fresh flowers could be brought into the house daily, as though nature itself had been instructed to serve. Closer to the shoreline, a boathouse anchored the estate to the water, while another ornamental structure introduced a note of the unexpected, a pagoda, visually distinct from the Tudor language of the main house, yet fully in keeping with the era's taste for curated exoticism. The estate was English at its center, but expansive in its self-confidence, borrowing from wherever it pleased. It had the sensibility of old money without the patience of old money. That distinction mattered, because patience, by then, was precisely what Kellogg no longer had. When the landscapers proposed the sensible approach, young trees, carefully planted, allowed to mature over years, he rejected it. Years were for younger men. He had spent too many of them already. He did not want to wait for beauty to arrive slowly. He wanted the finished effect at once. Mature trees were hauled in and transplanted so that the grounds would appear fully established, their shade and grandeur instantly available. The decision tells you almost everything. This was not just vanity. It was biography expressed through horticulture. Kellogg had spent his youth and middle age delayed, underestimated, and made to serve someone else's timetable. At Gull Lake, he insisted that time itself be overruled. There is something moving in that impatience, and something faintly unsettling too. The estate was not merely a reward, it was an argument with the past. For years, W.K. Kellogg had watched other men inhabit comfort while he handled the necessary drudgery beneath it. He had known the mechanics of power long before he possessed any of its privileges. He kept books, took orders, managed details, absorbed humiliations, and learned the invisible labor by which larger reputations are protected and sustained. By the time he reached Gull Lake, he was no longer willing to admire other people's lives from the service entrance. He intended, finally, to occupy the main rooms. And yet he named this 15,000 square foot manor simply the cottage. It is one of those gestures that reveals more the longer you look at it. On one level, the name reads as understatement, an old American habit among the very rich, who have long preferred euphemism to confession. On another, it feels like irony sharpened into private wit. A Tudor manor with imported materials, ornamental structures, landscaped grounds, and commanding lake views called a cottage by a man who had once had almost nothing. The phrase contains both self-awareness and self-protection. Perhaps he was mocking the very language of grandeur. Perhaps he was normalizing it for himself. Perhaps, after a lifetime of subordination, the right to name an obvious palace something smaller was itself a form of victory. Whatever the intention, the word remains revealing. It suggests that even at the height of his success, W.K. Kellogg carried within him the psychic habits of scarcity. Men who grow up secure do not usually need to disguise magnificence. Men who arrive late to power sometimes do. The estate was lavish, but its name whispered restraint, as though extravagance could be softened by diction. Still, the place was never only about pleasure. It was an image of arrival, yes, but also an architecture of correction. Here was a man who had grown up overlooked, built a fortune from the corner of the breakfast table, and translated industrial success into the visual codes of permanence, cultivation, and control. At Gull Lake, he did not just purchase land, he purchased atmosphere. He purchased distance from Battle Creek. He purchased the illusion that a man can step far enough into beauty to leave humiliation behind. But he could not. Because the house, however serene it appeared above the water, stood on ground haunted by older history. The wealth that made it possible was inseparable from the struggle that had shaped him. To understand why this estate mattered so much, why it had to look ancient, why it had to feel complete, why it had to exist at all, you have to leave the lake and go back to the town where the damage began. You have to return to Battle Creek, to the world of reform, discipline, and invention, and to the two brothers whose shared name would help define the modern American breakfast. One would become celebrated first, the other would endure longer. Between them lay ambition, resentment, dependency, and a bitterness so durable that success could not dissolve it. The house at Gull Lake was the reward. It was also the evidence. And the story of how W.K. Kellogg came to build it begins not with triumph, but with subordination. In the 1860s, Battle Creek, Michigan was not merely a town on the edge of the American Midwest. It was a place charged with spiritual tension, a community shaped by the conviction that history itself was running out. While much of the nation staggered out of Civil War bloodshed and turned its attention toward railroads, factories, and the making of fortunes, Battle Creek was preoccupied with a different kind of future. Here, among prayer meetings, dietary rules, and prophetic expectation, the Seventh-day Adventist movement was building one of its strongest centers. Its followers believed Christ's return was near. Daily life in that atmosphere acquired an unusual severity. Appetite was suspect. Pleasure was suspect. The body was not a private possession but a vessel under inspection, something to be disciplined, managed, and kept clean for judgment. That world formed the background of the Kellogg family. John Preston Kellogg, a broom maker by trade, and his wife Anne built their household inside that climate of piety, labor, and unease. It was a large family even by the standards of the age, and tragedy moved through it with the familiarity that 19th century parents knew too well. 6 of their children died of infectious illness. The surviving children were raised in a home where religion was not simply belief, but atmosphere, where physical weakness, moral failure, and divine scrutiny were never entirely separate ideas. Health was discussed with the intensity other families reserved for money. Death was not abstract. Sin was not abstract. Everything felt close. Out of that house came 2 boys whose names would become inseparable from one of the most recognizable products in American life, though almost nothing about their early trajectories suggested equality. John Harvey Kellogg, born in 1852, entered the world first and quickly established himself as the exceptional one. Frail in body, he nonetheless possessed the kind of mind that institutions know how to reward. Childhood illness left him physically compromised. Tuberculosis damaged one lung and marked him permanently. But weakness, in some people, sharpens ambition instead of softening it. The church leadership noticed him early. He was intelligent, intense, disciplined, and clearly useful to a movement that wanted doctors as well as believers. In a religious culture that prized reform, purity, and control, John Harvey seemed destined for prominence. He was not merely educated, he was selected. Will Keith Kellogg, born 8 years later, was not. From the beginning, the younger brother occupied a more obscure position inside the family, and more importantly, inside the family imagination. Where John Harvey was spoken of with expectation, Will was more often treated as a problem to be managed. He struggled in school, but not because he lacked ability. His vision was poor, and in an age before routine intervention, that fact passed with astonishing ease into misjudgment. He could not see the board clearly. Teachers assumed dullness. Adults assumed limitation. No one thought to ask whether the boy's apparent slowness had anything to do with what he literally could not see. It is one of those small cruelties of family history that later seems almost too symbolic. The child who would one day build a commercial empire spent his earliest years being treated as though he lacked promise altogether. By 13, Will was out of school. There would be no elegant trajectory for him, no sponsored education, no public cultivation of his talents. Instead, he was put to work selling brooms from door to door, learning the hard, unglamorous mechanics of persuasion in American households. It was the kind of apprenticeship no one romanticizes until it produces a fortune. He learned how to read hesitation in the face of a customer. He learned how to absorb rejection without collapsing under it. He learned prices, margins, stock, delivery, repetition. These are not the skills that draw reverence in youth, but they often matter later more than brilliance does. While his older brother advanced toward medicine and institutional stature, Will was learning the intimate grammar of selling ordinary things to skeptical people. The contrast between them widened with every passing year. John Harvey was sent outward into the world of formal training. He studied in New Jersey, then at the University of Michigan, and later in New York, building the credentials that would make him not merely employable, but authoritative. By the time he returned to Battle Creek in 1876, he came back not as a local son, but as a professional man, young, polished, medically trained, and ready to take command of a troubled Adventist health institution that church leaders hoped he might rescue. The institution itself had been founded as an experiment in holy discipline applied to the body. It was meant to embody Adventist principles of health reform, to turn theology into regimen. But it needed structure, energy, and a public face. John Harvey provided all three. At only 24, he assumed leadership and immediately rebranded the place with a new name that was both clinical and theatrical, the Battle Creek Medical and Surgical Sanitarium. Even the word carried his stamp. It suggested hygiene, science, and cure, but also something more totalizing, an environment in which the body might be reordered under expert supervision. In time, that institution would grow into one of the most famous health destinations in America, attracting people with money, status, anxiety, and the means to convert personal distress into extended treatment. But before it became an empire, it was also a workplace. And in that same pivotal year, 1876, Will Keith Kellogg entered its doors, not as a visitor, not as a protege, and certainly not as an equal. He entered as an employee. The arrangement was practical on its face. John Harvey needed dependable help. The institution required books to be kept, schedules managed, letters answered, details handled. Will needed wages. There was work to be done, and within a family economy shaped by hierarchy, it probably seemed natural that the less celebrated brother would attach himself to the more accomplished one. Yet the consequences of that decision would reach far beyond convenience. What appeared at first to be a straightforward family employment arrangement would become one of the central emotional structures of both men's lives. Because service has a way of hardening into identity when it lasts too long. Will entered the sanitarium from below. He was there to account, organize, carry out instructions, and absorb the dull weight of administrative labor that allows charismatic men to seem effortless. John Harvey would become the visible architect of the institution's prestige. Will would spend years beneath that prestige, helping hold it together. One brother acquired renown, the other acquired knowledge of how renown is maintained. One moved toward public grandeur, the other toward private exhaustion. And yet this was also the beginning of something more complicated than simple subordination. Inside the sanitarium, Will was not just being employed, he was being formed. He was learning systems, habits, workflows, purchasing, correspondence, logistics, and the strange alchemy by which discipline, branding, and belief could be turned into a marketable enterprise. He may have entered as a subordinate, but he was also studying, whether consciously or not, the machinery of success. No one around them could have fully seen what was taking shape. Not yet. At that moment, the hierarchy seemed fixed. John Harvey was the star, educated, chosen, institutional, already moving toward the kind of fame that flatters religious movements and attracts money. Will was the younger brother with weak eyes, interrupted schooling, and no evident path beyond work. Their positions appeared almost ordained. They were anything but. Still, for the time being, the balance held. John Harvey commanded. Will Keith served. The sanitarium expanded. The younger brother remained at his post, doing the invisible work that history tends to compress into a sentence, and families often forget altogether. What began as an ordinary necessity in 1876 would stretch not for a season, but for a quarter century. And by the time it ended, the damage between them was already deep. John Harvey Kellogg was not a large man, but he understood spectacle. He cultivated it with the precision of someone who knew that authority was never just practiced, it was staged. He appeared in white from head to foot, white suit, white shoes, white necktie, as if he had dressed himself in the visual language of sterility, virtue, and command. Perched on his shoulder, there was sometimes a white cockatoo, a detail so strange it tipped into legend. Patients remembered him not only because he was brilliant, or severe, or famous, but because he seemed to have designed himself as carefully as he designed his institution. The pointed beard, the round spectacles, the compact body moving briskly through corridors of illness and discipline, he looked less like an ordinary physician than like the high priest of some modern American faith. And in a way, he was. By the turn of the 20th century, Battle Creek Sanitarium had become one of the most recognizable institutions in the United States. Part hospital, part resort, part moral theater, and part machine for converting anxiety into treatment. What had begun as a modest Adventist health facility had expanded into a sprawling complex spread across dozens of acres, with scores of buildings and a central structure vast enough to house an astonishing number of guests. Hundreds upon hundreds of workers kept it in motion. Doctors, nurses, attendants, cooks, cleaners, clerks, technicians, an entire invisible workforce sustained the illusion that wellness could be engineered if only one submitted completely enough. The place ran not merely on ideas, but on scale. And scale attracted power. The people who came to Battle Creek were not the obscure sick or the merely curious. They were presidents, industrialists, inventors, celebrities, heirs, reformers, and the exhausted rich. They arrived not simply to recover, but to be seen recovering in the right place. This was where public men with private strain came to submit themselves to purification. American prestige passed through these corridors in dressing gowns. Political figures came seeking restoration. Captains of industry arrived under the weight of overwork and reputation. Famous minds came when they could no longer trust the machinery of their own thoughts. The sanitarium offered something more alluring than medicine alone. It offered the elite a disciplined retreat where modern stress could be recast as bodily imbalance and treated with ritual seriousness. Battle Creek became, in effect, a sanctuary for people powerful enough to professionalize their distress. Then, in the early hours of February 18, 1902, disaster struck. Fire broke out before dawn and moved quickly through the main building, turning one of the most celebrated institutions in America into a site of panic and smoke. Guests were forced out into the freezing Michigan darkness, roused from sleep, and rushed into the night while staff struggled to save lives amid confusion and flame. The loss was immense. Much of it was not protected. For another man, the fire might have been a humiliation or even an ending. For John Harvey Kellogg, it became an opportunity to rebuild his power in larger form. What rose in its place was not a replacement so much as an escalation. The new sanitarium opened grander than before, more imposing, more self-assured, more architecturally authoritative. Its later additions pushed it even further into the skyline, until it towered over Battle Creek, like an institution that no longer belonged merely to the town that housed it. It had become one of those American establishments that operate almost like private empires, a place with its own doctrines, its own internal rhythms, its own mythology, and a founder whose personality was stamped across every wall, whether or not his name appeared there. At the center of that mythology was a theory of the human body that was at once earnest, controlling, inventive, and faintly deranged. Kellogg believed that most illness began in the digestive system. The bowels, in his view, were not a secondary concern, but the central battlefield of health. Disease was not simply something one caught. It was something one fostered internally through stagnation, impurity, indulgence, and failure of regimen. His answer was elimination. Literal, relentless elimination. He devised methods, devices, schedules, and systems meant to flush the body clean, as though disorder itself could be expelled by force. The most notorious of these treatments revolved around colonic irrigation on an industrial scale. Water was introduced in enormous quantities, repeatedly, with a confidence that only true believers or true obsessives can sustain. Patients were subjected to this regime daily, sometimes more than once, in the conviction that internal cleansing was the gateway to recovery. But cleansing, in Kellogg's world, was never just physical, it was moralized. He believed the digestive tract should be repopulated with good organisms, and this conviction led to one of the sanitarium's strangest practices, yogurt as therapy, administered in ways that collapsed the line between health science and ceremonial absurdity. It was part nutrition, part doctrine, part invasion. For those needing further stimulation, the institution offered an array of mechanical interventions that now read like artifacts from an alternate medical civilization. There were vibrating devices meant to shake the body into cooperation, cabinets of electric light that promised restorative effects through illumination and heat, Electrified machines that pulse current through the patient in the name of vitality. Mechanical horses for those too weak or too refined to exercise in any ordinary way. The entire place operated on the seductive American belief that technology, properly applied, could conquer the humiliations of flesh. And yet the most powerful obsession animating John Harvey Kellogg was not digestion, it was desire. This is the point at which the sanitarium begins to feel less like a medical center and more like a total system of control. Kellogg's deepest fear was not simply illness, but appetite ungoverned, especially sexual appetite. He saw erotic life not as a normal element of being human, but as a destabilizing force, something corrosive to health, willpower, and moral order. He married, but his marriage itself became part of the legend surrounding him. Formal, austere, emotionally opaque, untouched by ordinary conjugal intimacy. The household he created was full of children in one sense, through fostering and adoption, but marked by renunciation in another. Biological reproduction seemed almost beside the point. Discipline was the true family principle. From that conviction grew a body of writing and lecturing that is startling not because it was hidden, but because it was public. Kellogg argued, repeatedly and with immense seriousness, that sexual self-stimulation led to a horrifying catalogue of consequences: physical weakness, skin problems, nervous disorders, heart trouble, mental collapse. His proposed preventions were not discreet, not moderate, and not metaphorical. They were punitive in spirit and often brutal in implication. The body, in his system, was not to be understood gently. It was to be corrected, sometimes through pain, sometimes through shame, always through authority. What is most unsettling is not simply that he believed such things, but that he preached them openly and was rewarded with audiences, readers, and institutional respect. In Battle Creek, repression was not incidental to the health program. It was woven into it. Food therefore became more than sustenance. It became governance. Rich flavors, spices, heavy dishes, sensual pleasures at the table, all were suspect because they might stir passions better left dormant. Blindness was not a culinary failure. It was a moral technology. Simple foods were thought to calm the system, quiet the senses, and keep bodily urges under restraint. The ideal meal, in this worldview, did not delight. It subdued. That is the paradox at the heart of the Kellogg story. Out of an institution devoted to denial, restraint, and purification would emerge one of the most successful breakfast products in history. Out of a regime designed to suppress appetite would come a food that would later be sold through pleasure, convenience, branding, and habit. What began as part of a philosophy of bodily control would eventually become mass-market nourishment. Light, crisp, efficient, and deeply American. But before it became that, it belonged to John Harvey Kellogg's strange kingdom, a place where the wealthy came to be cleansed, where health was indistinguishable from discipline, where modern fame and private anxiety met under one roof, and where the body was treated not as a mystery to be understood, but as a problem to be managed. It was a brilliant institution. It was also unmistakably a haunted one. In 1884, W.K. Kellogg wrote a line in his diary that feels, in retrospect, less like a passing mood than a private verdict on the first half of his life. He confessed his fear that poverty was not a condition he would pass through, but a fate he might never escape. At the time, he was 24 years old. He had already spent years working for his older brother at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and he had no reason yet to believe the arrangement would end in anything but permanent subordination. The empire that would one day make his name familiar around the world did not yet exist. What existed was duty, exhaustion, and the slow humiliation of being necessary without ever being honored. To understand W.K. Kellogg's eventual rise, you have to resist the temptation to make it feel inevitable. It was not. His success did not emerge from a clear path of ambition, steadily rewarded. It emerged from confinement. For a quarter century, he lived inside another man's institution and, more painfully, inside another man's hierarchy. He was not the visionary on stage, not the physician receiving dignitaries, not the public face of reform. He was the one who made the machinery run. He handled the accounts, the letters, the calendars, the purchasing, the small crises, the silent corrections, the endless details that disappear behind charismatic authority. He worked brutally long hours, before dawn, after dark, and through the stretches in between where ordinary people have meals or rest or family life. Time, in his world, did not belong to him. But labor alone was not what wounded him. Men can survive hard work more easily than they survive degradation. The deeper injury was personal. John Harvey Kellogg did not treat his younger brother like a partner in formation or even like kin. He treated him as someone whose usefulness entitled him to command. WK was expected to be perpetually available, not simply during business hours, but as a matter of posture, as though his own existence had been absorbed into the schedule of a greater man. If the doctor had a thought while moving across the grounds, WK was there to capture it. If a dictation needed taking in circumstances that would have embarrassed most men, embarrassment itself was beside the point. The rule was absolute availability. No boundary was too small to be crossed if efficiency demanded it. Even language reinforced the structure. WK did not address his brother casually, and certainly not affectionately. He was expected to use the formal title, Dr. Kellogg, again and again, a ritual repetition of rank. It is a revealing detail, because titles inside families are rarely about clarity. They are about power. Every time the younger brother spoke, the hierarchy was reaffirmed. And yet he stayed. He stayed because there were practical reasons to stay, and because practical reasons often become emotional prisons. His education had been interrupted early. He had no independent capital. His experience, however extensive, had been accumulated inside an institution defined by someone else's vision. Battle Creek was not merely where he worked. It was the horizon of what seemed possible. For men of limited means in late 19th century America, escape was not a romantic act. It required leverage, money, confidence, timing, and a belief in oneself strong enough to survive ridicule. WK had little of any of these, at least at first, so he remained where he was, useful, overworked, diminished, watching. And watching, as it turned out, mattered. Because from that subordinate position, he saw something his brother did not. He watched ideas migrate out of the sanitarium and into the marketplace. He watched products associated with health reform detach from doctrine and become commercial opportunity. He watched other men, some of them far less burdened than he was, make fortunes from concepts that had circulated through Battle Creek's peculiar world of digestive purity and dietary discipline. C.W. Post, most famously, transformed sanitarium-inspired food products into enormous wealth. Others followed. Around the town, cereal companies began to proliferate, each one taking advantage of a changing American appetite. Lighter breakfasts, packaged convenience, branded modernity. Battle Creek was no longer just a religious outpost or medical center. It was becoming the unlikely capital of a new industry. For John Harvey, cereal remained secondary, a practical extension of his philosophy, a dietary instrument in the larger project of bodily reform. He was interested in systems, theories, institutions, and control. WK, by contrast, had spent too many years among ledgers, customers, and routine not to recognize what was happening. He understood, perhaps more clearly than the famous doctor ever would, that products have lives separate from the ideas that produce them. Once they leave the institution, they belong to desire, habit, taste, repetition. Americans were not going to organize their mornings around theological discipline. They were going to organize them around what was easy, appealing, and reliable. And this insight was not glamorous, but it was transformative. By the time he reached his mid-40s, The emotional stakes had sharpened. WK had now spent virtually his entire adult life helping sustain institutions and reputations that were not his own. He had watched others turn attention into money, while his own labor remained buried beneath someone else's name. The years had given him competence, but also a mounting sense of waste. There comes a moment in certain lives when endurance stops feeling virtuous and starts feeling intolerable. For WK, that moment arrived late, but once it arrived, it changed everything. In February 1906, he finally stepped out on his own and established the company that would become the foundation of his fortune. The move was decisive not only in business terms, but in psychological ones. For the first time, he was no longer administering another man's vision. He was staking his own. There is something almost brutal in the simplicity of the transition. No grand public rupture, no theatrical declaration, just the quiet but irreversible act of taking control of the cereal business for himself. He acquired his brother's interest, created a company around the product, and entered the market not as a subordinate functionary, but as a proprietor. After decades of serving power, he now had a chance to shape it. What followed reveals the difference between the two brothers more clearly than any family anecdote ever could. John Harvey understood reform. WK understood consumers. The distinction sounds obvious now, but it was not obvious then. The elder brother believed in health food as discipline. The younger brother grasped that mass success required seduction. Whatever its origins in the world of sanitarium blindness, cereal would not become a national staple by asking Americans to view breakfast as moral medicine. It would succeed by being pleasant, modern, and easy to trust. WK adjusted the product accordingly. He made it more appealing to ordinary taste. He moved it away from asceticism and closer to enjoyment. That choice may sound small, but commercially it was revolutionary. He was taking a product born in the world of restraint and translating it into the language of mass-market desire. Just as important, he understood promotion. This was one of his true gifts, the instinct not merely to make a product, but to make it visible. WK was willing to spend aggressively on advertising at a moment when many businessmen still treated it as secondary or wasteful. He placed a substantial portion of his early resources behind a single magazine campaign built around a playful, memorable gimmick. Samples were offered. Grocers were drawn into the performance. Housewives were invited into the game. It was clever, consumer-facing, and modern in its tone. Light, where the sanitarium had been stern. Suggestive, where the old health reform world had been didactic. The campaign worked spectacularly. Demand surged. Sales multiplied. A product that had once belonged to the niche world of reform food began its transformation into a national habit. WK did not stop there. He pushed harder. More promotions, more sampling, more repetition, more insistence. He recognized that the new century would reward the brand that could claim space in the public imagination before its rivals did. The shelves of America were becoming battlegrounds, and silence was a form of defeat. If John Harvey built institutions through authority, WK built markets through visibility. And then he did something even more revealing. He put himself on the box, not literally, of course, but in a way that may have mattered more. He affixed his signature to the package as a mark of personal guarantee. It was a brilliant move on several levels at once. Commercially, it gave the product individuality and trust. Symbolically, it was an assertion of authorship. After years of invisible labor, he was no longer content to stand behind the curtain. His name, his actual hand, stylized into a public mark, now traveled into kitchens everywhere. The signature said, "This is mine." It was branding, certainly, but it was also emancipation in graphic form. That small flourish endures because it solved two problems at once. It sold the cereal, and it gave WK what he had been denied for decades: visible credit. For John Harvey, this evolution was difficult to ignore and impossible to welcome. He had underestimated both the product and the man. What he regarded as a dietary sideline was becoming a commercial force. What he once treated as subordinate labor was now appearing in public as independent success. Resentment began to move in both directions. WK, who had lived so long under condescension, was unlikely to feel generosity toward the brother who had profited from his obedience. John Harvey, accustomed to primacy, was not the kind of man to watch a younger brother eclipse him without resistance. It is here that family conflict hardens into something colder and more dangerous. Competition backed by law, money, ego, and the unstable question of ownership. Because the brothers did not merely share history. They shared a name. And in American business, a family name can be an inheritance, a weapon, a brand, or all three at once. By 1908, John Harvey entered the cereal trade directly under the Kellogg name, signaling that he had no intention of conceding the field to the brother he had once commanded. The move was commercially provocative and emotionally combustible. The old relationship was over. The dynamic of master and servant had collapsed, but it had not given way to reconciliation. It had given way to rivalry. That rivalry was about more than cereal, and more even than money. It was about who had the right to define what the name Kellogg meant in the modern world. Was it medical authority, reform, and sanitarium prestige? Or was it packaging, advertising, and the breakfast table? Was the elder brother the source, with the younger merely profiting from what originated elsewhere? Or had the younger brother, through instinct and discipline, transformed a minor idea into a national institution the elder never could have built? These were legal questions eventually, but first they were questions of identity. And identity within families like this is rarely negotiable. The tragedy of W.K. Kellogg's liberation is that freedom did not erase the damage that had preceded it. Success changed his position in the world, but not the emotional architecture formed over 25 years. He had escaped dependence, yes. He had created wealth, yes. He had discovered in himself not just competence, but genius of a particular American kind, the genius of mass-market intuition. But liberation did not soften him. It sharpened him. The man who emerged from his brother's shadow did not step into peace. He stepped into battle. The anonymous bookkeeper had become an industrialist. The younger brother had become a national brand. The servant, at last, had become someone his elder could neither patronize nor ignore. And that, more than almost anything else, made war unavoidable. What, exactly, belongs to a family? The bloodline, certainly. The resentments, almost always. But what about the name itself? Especially once that name begins to generate money, prestige, and public trust. At what point does a surname stop being inheritance and become property? And if two brothers carry the same name into the marketplace, which one, in the eyes of the law and the public, has the stronger claim to it? By the early 20th century, that question had ceased to be philosophical in Battle Creek. It had become commercial, legal, and deeply personal. The word Kellogg no longer belonged only to a family. It belonged to packaging, advertising, product labels, newspaper copy, store shelves, and the increasingly crowded world of American breakfast foods. Both brothers understood that much. What they could not agree on was who had the right to own its future. This was never just a trademark dispute, though on paper that is what it became. It was a struggle over authorship, over identity, over memory. One brother believed the name drew its authority from decades of medical fame, institutional power, and public prominence. The other believed the name had been redefined in the minds of ordinary Americans by branding, repetition, and commerce. Beneath the legal arguments lay a more corrosive question. When the country heard the word Kellogg, which brother did it actually mean? By 1910, consumer confusion was already a practical problem. Products associated with both men were circulating under the same surname. To shoppers, the distinction was muddy. To lawyers, that confusion was actionable. To the brothers themselves, it was intolerable. W.K. Kellogg, who had spent years building not only a cereal company, but a national brand, moved first. He sought to stop his brother from using the family name on cereal products in a way that threatened the identity of his own growing enterprise. There was an attempt, briefly, to contain the damage. The matter was settled outside court. But private settlements in family wars are often less like peace treaties than temporary armistices. Terms may be written down. Grievances rarely are. Nothing essential had been resolved. The old humiliations remained. The question of origin remained. Most importantly, the name itself remained contested. So, the conflict returned. By 1916, the brothers were back in open legal combat, and by then, the stakes were even sharper. John Harvey had not retreated from the field. He continued to market cereal products under the Kellogg name, effectively insisting that his identity, reputation, and prior stature entitled him to do so. W.K., meanwhile, had invested heavily in making that same name synonymous not with sanitarium theory, but with mass-market breakfast cereal. Each man believed the other was profiting from value he had created. Each believed the other was trespassing on ground that was rightfully his. What makes these disputes so ferocious is that they rarely turn on facts alone. They turn on competing narratives, and both brothers had excellent narratives. John Harvey's was, in a certain sense, the grander one. He was the older brother, the public figure, the physician of international reputation. He had spent decades constructing an identity that fused science, moral authority, and elite patronage. His institution had drawn presidents, tycoons, inventors, public men exhausted by the burdens of prominence. His books circulated widely. His name carried weight well beyond Michigan. To him, the surname Kellogg had long signified something serious: health, discipline, expertise, reform. If Americans trusted that name, he could argue, it was because he had spent a lifetime making it matter. W.K.'s case was less lofty, but in the modern marketplace it was probably more powerful. He did not claim the moral grandeur of reform. He claimed the practical reality of public recognition. He had poured money into advertising. He had placed his own signature on every box. He had taught grocers to sell the product and households to ask for it. He had moved the Kellogg name from the specialized world of sanitarium culture into the ordinary rituals of American domestic life. Whatever dignity the name once carried in reform circles, he had turned it into consumer memory. And consumer memory, in a capitalist society, is its own kind of sovereignty. When the dispute reached the Michigan Supreme Court, the courtroom became something larger than a venue for technical questions. It became a stage on which two competing versions of American success faced one another. On one side stood institutional prestige, the doctor, the reformer, the man of ideas and authority, whose reputation had been shaped in lecture halls, hospital corridors, and among the powerful. On the other stood commercial genius, the marketer, the builder, the man who understood that modern fame could be manufactured at scale through packaging, promotion, and repetition. Witnesses were called. Histories were reconstructed. The origins of cornflakes, the development of cereal products, the rise of the sanitarium, the evolution of the Kellogg name in public consciousness, all of it was drawn into legal scrutiny. What had once been family history became evidence. What had once been resentment became testimony. And at the heart of it all was a question so simple it was almost brutal. When an ordinary American housewife reached for a cereal box labeled Kellogg, whose reputation was she relying on? John Harvey's answer was rooted in chronology and stature. He was, after all, the first famous Kellogg. Long before his younger brother mastered mass advertising, John Harvey had given the surname cultural authority. He had attached it to health reform, medical innovation, and institutional seriousness. In his telling, W.K. was not the creator of the name's value, but the beneficiary of it, a businessman leveraging prestige he had inherited rather than built. The implication was clear. and cutting. The younger brother had not invented legitimacy, he had monetized it. WK's answer was rooted in the marketplace, where sentiment counts for less than recognition. He argued, in effect, that whatever the name had once meant in the world of medicine, it now meant something else in the minds of consumers. It meant cereal, it meant the breakfast table, it meant the product he had spent years manufacturing, promoting, and distinguishing from imitators. He had not borrowed a reputation, he had redirected and enlarged it. If the public now associated Kellogg with boxed cereal rather than institutional hygiene, that shift was not accidental. It was the result of his labor, his strategy, his money, and his instinct. This is what made the case so revealing. It was not merely about legal rights. It was about the transfer of cultural power from one American world to another. John Harvey belonged to the era of moral authority, expert systems, grand institutions, and reformist seriousness. WK belonged to the era that was replacing it, the age of branding, consumer habit, mass distribution, and the democratization of recognition. The brothers were not simply fighting over a name, they were fighting over which kind of American power would define it. When the decision finally came in December 1920, it was decisive. WK, Kellogg prevailed. He was granted exclusive rights to the Kellogg name in the cereal business, and the outcome went beyond symbolic vindication. It affirmed that the commercial identity of the name, at least in this sphere, belonged to him. The court recognized what the marketplace had already begun to make obvious. In the cereal aisle, Kellogg meant WK, not John Harvey. For the older brother, it was more than a legal defeat. It was a humiliation of a particularly bitter kind. The physician who had once presided over one of the country's most famous health institutions, the man whose reputation had towered over Battle Creek for decades, was effectively told that in one of the most successful consumer categories to emerge from his orbit, his own surname no longer belonged to him. Worse still, the ruling carried financial consequences. He was required to surrender profits earned from cereal sales under the contested name. The law did not merely declare WK the winner, it made John Harvey pay for having lost. It is difficult to overstate what such a result does inside a family conflict already poisoned by old hierarchies. Courts can settle rights. They almost never settle emotions. WK had won the argument that mattered in commerce. He had done something perhaps even more satisfying. He had defeated his brother on a public stage governed by evidence rather than intimidation. The younger man, once treated as an underling, had now achieved a form of triumph that no private apology could have matched. He was not merely successful, he was right in the eyes of the law. And yet victory did not soften him. This is one of the dark truths that runs through so many dynastic stories. Vindication is not the same thing as peace. In fact, it often deepens estrangement because it confirms injuries instead of dissolving them. WK did not emerge from the litigation newly able to forgive. He emerged confirmed in everything he had long believed about his brother, his arrogance, his possessiveness, his refusal to recognize another man's contribution until compelled to do so by force. After the ruling, the relationship was never restored. If they had once been bound by obligation, they were now divided by judgment. Their contact became minimal, careful, and emotionally sterilized. When circumstances required them to be in proximity, WK reportedly refused the vulnerability of being alone with his brother. He insisted on intermediaries, witnesses, buffers, human partitions between himself and the man who had defined so much of his early life. It is a striking image, two brothers living in the same small city, their surname visible across America, yet unable to occupy a room together without supervision. The legal war had ended, the emotional one had not. John Harvey continued with the sanitarium, still committed to his own system, still sustained by the world he had built. WK continued expanding the cereal company into one of the most recognizable food businesses in the country. Their trajectories no longer overlapped, except in memory and on paper. Publicly, both remained formidable in their own domains. Privately, they had become examples of a familiar old American tragedy: shared blood, shared ambition, shared origin, and no remaining trust. Battle Creek itself must have made the estrangement feel stranger. It was not a great metropolis where distance can be hidden inside anonymity. It was a relatively small city, intimate enough that reputations echoed. Their names would have appeared in conversation, on buildings, in newspapers, on products, in legal documents, in social circles touched by business and reform. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone understood, at least in outline, that the brothers existed in parallel but not together. The town that had produced them could not reconcile them. And so the surname endured, but the family did not. That is often how these stories end, not with extinction, but with separation so complete that what survives in the public world bears only a faint resemblance to the human bond from which it began. The brand remains. The institution remains. The estate, the company, the signature, the carefully managed legacy remain. What disappears is the intimate structure beneath them, the possibility of mutual regard. For WK, the ruling was total in one sense and hollow in another. He had secured exclusive rights to the name in the sphere that mattered most to his fortune. He had proven that consumer America recognized his authorship. He had defeated the brother who had once kept him in formal, humiliating orbit. But law cannot restore a childhood of neglect, or undo decades of condescension, or erase the memory of being treated like staff in one's own family. Success can reverse status. It cannot retroactively make love where there was control. That may be the most haunting detail of all. W.K. Kellogg got what he wanted: ownership, recognition, the name itself, and still did not get free. The brothers remained in the same town, under the same sky, attached forever to the same word. Across the country, that word signaled familiarity, dependability, breakfast, routine. To the public, it looked clean, confident, settled. But beneath it lay one of the oldest and least solvable forms of damage: a family story in which triumph and bitterness advanced together until each became impossible to separate from the other. Late in life, W.K. Kellogg made a remark that sounds simple until you sit with it. He said that as a boy, he never really learned how to play. It is the kind of sentence that can be passed over too quickly, mistaken for nostalgia or mild regret. It was something darker than that. It was a summary of a childhood shaped by austerity, usefulness, and denial. In the Adventist world that formed him, pleasure was monitored, leisure was suspect, and frivolity had little moral standing. Then came the long decades under his brother's authority, where every waking hour had to justify itself in labor. There had been no open field in his life, no idle afternoon, no spaciousness of spirit. By the time he had the means to create beauty for himself, he was already an old man. And so, at 65, he built not merely a residence, but a setting in which delight might finally be permitted. The manor at Gull Lake was, in one sense, a triumph of money and taste, a carefully staged Tudor retreat high above the water, composed with the confidence of a man who had earned the right to withdraw. But in another sense, more private and more revealing, it was an attempt to correct something that could never quite be corrected. W.K. was not only building a country estate, he was building the emotional architecture of the life he had been denied. Space, calm, beauty, recreation, seasonal family ritual, these were not luxuries in the shallow sense. They were compensations. He was trying, belatedly, to invent a world in which play could exist without guilt. He did not enter that world alone. By then, his life had already taken its second turn in marriage. His first wife, Ella, had died years earlier, and in 1918 he remarried. His second wife, Dr. Carrie Staines, came from the very institutional world that had shaped so much of his own life. She had worked at the Battle Creek Sanitarium and understood both the discipline and the ambitions of that orbit. If the house at Gull Lake represented escape, it was an escape undertaken by two people who knew exactly what had come before it. When the manor was completed and the couple settled there, the estate began to assume the social rhythm WK had clearly imagined for it, not only a private refuge, but a family landscape. That may have been the deepest satisfaction it offered him. Grandchildren came for extended visits, the house filled with motion, noise, and the kinds of casual pleasures that had scarcely existed in his own youth. Children crossed its rooms without fear of violating some severe domestic code. They played games indoors. They moved through the billiard room not as intruders in an adult world, but as rightful occupants of joy. Outside, the estate opened around them in lawns, water, pathways, and summer air. They ran. They explored. They splashed in the lake below the bluff. It is difficult not to feel the quiet ache beneath that image. W.K. Kellogg, who had grown up in a world of labor and restraint, now sat in late life watching another generation inhabit ease as though it were natural. That, perhaps, was his version of happiness, not so much to play himself, but to witness play without punishment. His own tastes were more subdued, more interior. One of the pleasures he cultivated at Gull Lake was motion pictures, especially silent films. There is something almost touching in that detail. Here was a man whose early life had been consumed by bookkeeping, schedules, obedience, and relentless work, now making space for projected light and story in the evening hours. He installed a projection system in the house and hosted screenings for family and guests. In the dark, as images flickered across the room, WK could do something he had spent much of his life unable to do: sit still and receive rather than produce. He did not have to account for anything. He did not have to keep pace with a stronger will. For a few hours, the room belonged to atmosphere, spectacle, and surrender. And yet, even in pleasure, one senses the habits of discipline never entirely left him. Almost as soon as the estate had become fully his, he and Carrie made a decision that reveals something important about how he understood ownership. They transferred the property to the city of Battle Creek, with the stipulation that they retain the right to live there for the rest of their lives. The arrangement was not a renunciation of luxury exactly, but it was an extraordinary gesture of reframing. The manor would not remain, in the long run, a sealed private kingdom. It would become a place meant for broader use, a site where others might find the recreation he himself had missed. The language attached to the gift was telling. The estate was to be a place where the people of Battle Creek could play. That word again, play. For WK, it was never casual. It had too much absence behind it. The estate also became a refuge in a more literal sense. In the late 1920s, he established a bird sanctuary on the grounds, intended in part to protect Canada geese, then regarded with concern as a declining species. This is the kind of detail that could seem charming if treated superficially, but it carries a richer emotional charge than that. By then, WK was a man who had spent his life mastering systems: industrial, managerial, philanthropic. At Gull Lake, he used land not merely to display taste, but to shelter life beyond human ambition. Migrating birds began to gather there. The estate, conceived as a private reward, took on another identity. It became a protected landscape, a pause in the violence and extraction that so often accompany wealth. The boy who had never known ease had made a haven, not only for family, but for creatures moving along older routes of survival. For a time, the picture held. But grand houses, even those built as instruments of repair, do not control history. The calm years at Gull Lake proved temporary. War has a way of repurposing private beauty, and the Second World War altered the fate of the manor, just as it altered the fate of so many estates, hotels, schools, and institutions across the country. The federal government requisitioned the property for military use. The house that had been conceived as retreat and inheritance ceased, for a time, to belong to its owner in any meaningful personal sense. W.K. and Carrie were forced to leave. He moved into a smaller house not far away. She withdrew to be nearer her own family. The great lakeside cottage, built out of late-life ambition and private longing, was absorbed into the state's wartime machinery. There is a certain irony in that transformation, and perhaps a certain justice too. For years, the estate served purposes far removed from domestic pleasure. First came military occupation. Then, after the Coast Guard vacated the property, the manor took on yet another identity. A place of rehabilitation for wounded servicemen connected to Percy Jones Army Hospital in Battle Creek. Men broken by war were sent there to recover their strength in rooms once intended for summer guests and family evenings. The house did what many great American estates eventually do when history presses hard enough. It stopped being a symbol and became infrastructure. And the irony deepens further when you consider the geography of those years. The wounded soldiers treated through that wartime medical network were linked back to the old sanitarium complex in Battle Creek, the very world in which W.K. had once labored for his brother in obscurity. It is as if the later chapters of his life kept bending back toward the place from which he had tried to escape, though always in altered form. The sanitarium became something else. The manor became something else. Private legacies drifted into public use. Carrie never returned to live again in the house they had made together. She died before that restoration could happen, and her death lends a further sadness to the estate's story. The life they had built there did not resume. By the time military use ended, the house stood not as the center of an ongoing domestic world, but as an emptied shell waiting for a new purpose. W.K. himself survived into great age, but not into renewal. He died in 1951, at 91, after a life so long and consequential that it can be tempting to describe it in terms of achievement alone. But achievement is too thin a word for what remained around him at the end. Estranged family lines, interrupted pleasures, a house transformed by history, and the peculiar solitude that often settles over men who have won too much at too high a cost. After his death, the estate passed into yet another phase of institutional life. Through the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, it was transferred to Michigan State University and became a biological station devoted to research and education. Once again, the manor slipped its original identity. It was no longer a summer palace, no longer merely a family seat, no longer a wartime holding or a rehabilitation center. It entered the long American afterlife of elite properties, repurposed, rationalized, folded into the public good, its beauty retained, but its meaning rewritten. That may be the most revealing thing about Gull Lake in the end. W.K. Kellogg built it to answer a private ache. He built it because success, after so many starved years, demanded form. He built it to create a world in which children could run freely, evenings could be spent in pleasure, and the harsh mechanics of his early life might be held at bay by architecture, water, and trees. But the estate refused to remain only that. Over time, it became larger than the wound that produced it. It served as retreat, theatre, family refuge, sanctuary, military asset, site of healing, and center of study. Its uses multiplied as its original emotional purpose receded into history. That is often what happens with houses built by powerful men. They begin as personal declarations and end as documents, evidence of longing, status, taste, and the limits of private control. The manor at Gull Lake was W.K. Kellogg's attempt to invent a gentler world at the edge of his own life. What survives there now is not just his wealth, but the shape of his yearning. In dynastic histories, the public record tends to preserve the victories and smooth over the damage. A company expands. A founder gives away millions. A name becomes permanent enough to feel inevitable. What disappears, unless you look closely, is the private wreckage that often accumulates alongside success. In W.K. Kellogg's case, the late chapters of his life were marked not by ease, but by a succession of family blows so intimate and so unforgiving that they cast a different light over everything he built. The first of them came in 1913, and it began with the kind of household accident that history would normally reduce to a line or two. His grandson Kenneth fell from a window. He lived, but survival was not the end of the story. The injuries left him permanently disabled, dependent on care for the rest of his life. It is one thing to imagine suffering in the abstract, quite another to watch it settle, daily and without relief, into the body of a child who belongs to you. For W.K., who had spent much of his life translating hardship into discipline and discipline into achievement, Kenneth's condition presented a different kind of truth. There are injuries that cannot be overcome by work, optimism, or managerial will. Some forms of vulnerability do not yield, they must simply be carried. By all accounts, the accident marked him deeply, not in the sentimental way public memory prefers, but in a quieter, more consequential sense. It altered the emotional direction of his wealth. The man who would later give away enormous portions of his fortune increasingly turned his attention toward children's health, disability, education, and care, not as abstractions, but as realities that had entered his own family and refused to leave. Philanthropy, in this light, was not merely civic generosity, it was grief reorganized into structure. And yet, even as his public benevolence expanded, his private household grew more fractured. 12 years after Kenneth's fall, another crisis arrived, this time in the person of his son, John Leonard. If W.K. had wanted an heir in the corporate sense, John Leonard seemed, on paper, almost ideal. He had spent years inside the business. He was capable, inventive, and materially important to the company's development. He helped improve the packaging that preserved freshness in the box, developed products, accumulated patents, and belonged to that practical, forward-moving world of industrial refinement that separates a passing success from a durable enterprise. He was not ornamental family. He mattered, which is why what happened next feels so cold. In 1925, W.K. removed him from the company, not because the son lacked talent, not because he had failed the business. He was cut off for reasons his father experienced as moral and personal. Divorce, remarriage, questions of loyalty, a business decision interpreted as betrayal. Whatever mixture of offense finally hardened W.K.'s resolve, the result was absolute. He did not simply dismiss his son from a role. He expelled him from succession, from proximity, and effectively from favor. The severing was not temporary. Father and son never repaired it. This is where the story begins to reveal the darker inheritance running beneath W.K. Kellogg's public image. He had spent years resenting the sternness, hierarchy, and emotional injury imposed on him by his own brother. He knew what it meant to live under the judgment of a stronger will. And yet, when his own authority was challenged by disappointment or perceived disloyalty, he could be just as unyielding. Success had liberated him from humiliation, but it had not made him gentle. The wound remained, and in some ways it reproduced itself. Then came 1930. America was entering the Great Depression, that vast national season of unemployment, hunger, and public dread, when private wealth was forced to confront moral scrutiny. It was during this period that W.K. established the foundation that would become one of the most important vehicles of his legacy. Over time, he committed an extraordinary sum to it, including a controlling share of the stock that represented the source of his fortune. The scale of the gift was immense. More important, though, was its direction. The foundation focused on children, their health, schooling, welfare, and physical well-being. Hospitals, clinics, training programs, educational institutions, nutritional support. These were not glamorous causes in the Gilded Age sense. They did not flatter the donor with marble grandeur or easy symbolism. They addressed need where it was most defenseless. And here Kenneth's shadow returns. One cannot say with certainty what private memory guided each decision, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. Institutions for children with disabilities, support for health and care, educational models that made room for those historically excluded, food for children during years when hunger had become common. WK may have rejected any soft-focus portrait of himself as a saint, but his giving had unmistakable emotional logic. He invested where suffering had become real to him. He spent not on abstract uplift, but on concrete forms of protection. He was characteristically blunt about it. He denied the pieties usually attached to philanthropy and insisted, in effect, that helping children gave him pleasure. It is a revealing statement, half deflection, half truth. Men of his generation, especially men who had built themselves through severity, often distrusted the language of virtue when applied to their own motives. Better to call oneself selfish than sentimental. Better to present generosity as instinct than confession. But whatever language he used, the scale and focus of his giving tell their own story. He did not merely donate, he redirected power. Then, just as his public legacy grew more secure, his body began its own retreat. In 1937, he was diagnosed with glaucoma. The disease advanced quickly, and with it came one of the crueler ironies of late life. A man who had spent decades mastering visibility, packaging, public recognition, and the architecture of appearance was gradually losing sight itself. Within a few years, he was blind. The final decade of his life unfolded in darkness. But blindness did not remove him from power. If anything, it sharpened the image of his will. He continued to attend board meetings. He remained engaged in company decisions. He still went to the factory, guided now by dogs and attendants rather than by his own eyes, yet no less determined to remain a presence in the enterprise he had built. This detail matters because it reveals something central about him. W.K. Kellogg did not understand identity as something detachable from work. Even after wealth, after fame, after philanthropy, he still returned to the machinery. Not because he needed the money, but because command itself had become part of how he existed in the world. And his instincts remained intact. During hard times, when cautious men argued for restraint, he insisted on force. When others recommended reducing advertising, he increased it dramatically. He understood something elemental about public attention. In a crisis, retreat can look like weakness, and silence can cost more than boldness. Even blind, he could still read the logic of the market. Then came the final family catastrophe. After cutting off John Leonard, W.K. had looked toward his grandson, John Jr., as a possible successor. Here again we see the old dynastic impulse. If one branch disappoints, another must be prepared to carry the name, the company, the future. But inheritance is not simply opportunity. It is pressure, projection, burden. John Jr. entered the business, advanced, and then faltered. Demotion followed. So did breakdown. In 1938, he took his own life. No amount of distance in the telling can soften that fact. By then, the private landscape around W.K. Kellogg had grown bleak. One grandson permanently disabled, another dead by suicide, a son estranged beyond repair. By the end, his surviving sons had broken contact with him entirely. For a man whose corporate success rested in part on selling nourishment, regularity, and family routine into American homes, the contradiction was devastating. He had helped shape the breakfast tables of millions while failing, in the most intimate sense, to preserve his own household. This is where the triumphant version of the Kellogg story begins to feel almost unbearable in its incompleteness. Yes, he built one of the great food companies of the modern age. Yes, he gave away vast wealth. Yes, he outlasted those who underestimated him and secured the public permanence of his name. All of that is true, but it exists alongside another truth. And the second truth is harder. He won in the world and lost at home. That does not make him a villain nor a martyr. It makes him something more unsettling and more recognizable. A builder of immense consequence, whose greatest achievements could not redeem the emotional costs required to reach them. The child once misjudged as dim became rich, powerful, and historically durable. The overlooked younger brother stepped out of subordination and into national prominence. But the price of that ascent did not vanish once the fortune was secured. It remained inside the family, inside silence, estrangement, suffering, and the inability, repeated across generations, to convert authority into tenderness. By the end of his life, W.K. Kellogg had what most men spend themselves chasing: wealth, legacy, institutional permanence, and a name that would survive him by more than a century. But the private arithmetic was harsher. His brother was still an enemy. His son would not return. His grandsons had been touched by catastrophe in different but equally devastating ways. The founder of a company associated with cheerful abundance had, in the most intimate sense, run out of people. He had built something that would endure. He had not preserved what mattered most. By 1943, John Harvey Kellogg was approaching the end not as a conqueror, but as a diminished patriarch, living among the ruins of his own certainty. He was 91 years old. The institution that had once made Battle Creek synonymous with purification, discipline, and elite recovery had collapsed years earlier. The church that had helped elevate him had cast him out long before that. The man who had once advised the powerful and treated the famous now faced death with far less of the authority that had once seemed inseparable from his name. And in that narrowing final season, he turned his mind back to his brother. Nearly 4 decades had passed since W.K. had stepped away from the sanitarium and into a life of his own. More than 2 decades had passed since the courtroom defeat that cost John Harvey control of the Kellogg name in the cereal business. By then, the distance between the brothers had hardened into ritual. They did not reconcile. They barely spoke. When circumstances forced proximity, it was managed carefully, almost formally, as though blood alone could no longer guarantee civility. Whatever they had once been to one another had long since been buried under injury, pride, and the peculiar cruelty of shared success. Still, as death approached, John Harvey did something he had never done when power was still his. He wrote to W.K. The letter was, by all accounts, an admission of fault. Not a legal concession, not a strategic note, but something simpler and far more difficult. An acknowledgement that he had wronged his younger brother, that he had failed to value him properly, that he had used him, diminished him, and not given him the credit he deserved. In other words, he put into writing what W.K. had waited a lifetime to hear. But timing, in tragedies like this, is rarely merciful. By then, W.K. was 83 and blind. The letter had to be read to him if it was to be heard at all. He refused. The envelope remained closed while his brother was still alive. Then John Harvey died, and only afterward did W.K. allow the contents to be spoken aloud. What he felt in that moment no one preserved. Perhaps vindication, perhaps regret, perhaps only the flat, exhausted knowledge that truth, when it arrives too late, can no longer heal anything. W.K. lived on for 8 more years. He remained active, still attached to the company that bore his name, still committed to the foundation through which he redirected his fortune. When he died at 91, he left behind one of the most recognizable brands in American life, a philanthropic legacy of enormous scale, and a family history marked as much by fracture as achievement. Today, the brothers lie in the same cemetery in Battle Creek, only feet apart. In death, they occupy a closeness they refused in life. The sanitarium is gone as they knew it. The strange therapies, the discipline, the grand authority of that world have faded into historical curiosity. But the manor at Gull Lake still stands, and the signature still survives on breakfast boxes in kitchens far from Michigan. Most people pour the cereal without thinking of the two men behind it, or the decades of humiliation, rivalry, and sorrow hidden beneath a familiar name. W.K. Kellogg became rich beyond anything he once feared possible. But one thing never changed. He did not learn forgiveness before the end. And so the war lasted longer than either brother did.